Welcome back to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going through all the chapters of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, breaking down a summary of each chapter, some key takeaways from the chapter, and finding out, most importantly, what each chapter tells us about God. If you have not hit the subscribe button already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, click that notification bell, and like this video. We upload new videos on this every single day, so you're not going to want to miss it. Make sure you click that subscribe button. Today, we're going into Genesis chapter 4. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into Genesis chapter 4, right into the summary. So the fall of man happened in Genesis chapter 3. Since then, many generations have passed, and Adam and Eve have now had many children over the course of time, from Genesis 3 to Genesis 4. Now, Genesis 4 tells us about two specific children they had named Cain and Abel. Two sons they had, Cain and Abel. And it tells us a story about Cain and Abel. And what Cain and Abel were doing, they were making offerings to God. Sacrifice was instituted back in Genesis chapter 3 when God killed the animal to cover Adam and Eve for their sin. And that practice continued of just making offerings to the Lord and sacrifices to the Lord. In Genesis chapter 4, their whole family was now doing this on a regular basis to offer sacrifices to God. And in doing this, Adam taught his children to do this, and so forth and so on. Cain brought his sacrifice from the field. He worked the fields. He brought his sacrifice from the field. Abel was a shepherd who took care of the animals, and he actually brought the firstborn lamb or firstborn of his flock as a shepherd to sacrifice to God. Only Abel's offering was acceptable to God, and Cain, being angry that his was not acceptable to God and Abel's was, Cain kills Abel out of that anger. And in that process, Abel's blood cries out from the ground to God for justice, and God confronts Cain and sends Cain away. Again, punishment comes and consequences come from disobedience. And in killing his brother, Cain is sent away to a faraway land with in God, separated from God, under a curse by God. And but the thing is, Cain says, if anyone who wants to avenge Abel's blood will come and kill me. And God shows again mercy, and he actually puts a mark on Cain to protect Cain as he gets sent out into this land, so no one will avenge Abel's blood by taking Cain's life. This is a very interesting story, and that's kind of the summary of what happens in chapter 4. Now, there's some key takeaways from this passage. So first, by this time, a sacrificial system had actually already been established where men were giving offerings to God. This sacrificial system plays a huge role as we continue throughout the Bible. And it was instituted by God in Genesis chapter 3, and then men continued this sacrificial system all the way through. This ultimately brings us as a picture to Jesus in the future. We also see Abel's sacrifice was acceptable. And we know that it was acceptable because it was made in faith. We know this from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 in the New Testament tells us that Abel's sacrifice was acceptable because it was made in faith. And that in contrast to Cain's was not made in faith. Now, faith is a word that just simply means trust. That Abel trusted God and therefore brought him the best. He brought him the firstborn from the flock. Cain, it doesn't say brought the first fruits from the field. It just says he brought some fruit from the field. So Cain didn't trust God enough to bring the best, but Abel did. And that faith is what made Abel's sacrifice acceptable and Cain's not acceptable. We also learn from this passage that unchecked anger is what led Cain to murder. Now, this is very important. Anger is a very, very difficult emotion to navigate. Anger in and of itself is not actually wrong. Anger is an emotion that God actually feels. There is a righteous anger, but it has to be checked. It has to be handled righteously. Cain's anger, though, came from a bad place. It wasn't a righteous anger. So Cain's anger actually came from jealousy. He was jealous that his brother's sacrifice was accepted. That jealousy came from insecurity. Cain, within himself, didn't feel secure, and that insecurity came from his lack of faith, lack of trust in God. Anger came from jealousy. Jealousy came from insecurity. And insecurity came in his lack of trusting in God or knowing who God was. His lack of knowledge of God led to him being insecure, which led to jealousy, which ultimately led to anger, which ultimately led to murder. Fourth thing that we want to take away from this passage: the blood of the innocent cries out for justice. The blood of Abel cried out to God from the ground for justice. God, we learned last chapter, God is a God of justice, and justice is important to God. The blood of the innocent cries out for justice. It's an important point. We're going to get into justice as we get in later into passages in the Old Testament. But justice is important, and anything that perverts justice is actually an affront on the very nature of God. And ultimately, fifth point from this passage, God is just in punishment while extending mercy. He was just in giving punishment to Cain for killing Abel, but he also was full of mercy that he literally marked Cain so that no one could kill Cain in vengeance for Abel's blood. So while God is a God of justice and punishes rightly, he also is a God of mercy. It's incredible that we understand God that way. So 5 things we learn about God from this passage. Again, we see that he is merciful. This is going to be a continuing theme throughout the Bible. God is merciful. Cain deserved to die. God showed mercy and protected him from death. We also see that he's a God who desires faith and trust. That when the sacrifices were being made to him, he accepted the sacrifice made in trust. God, in the relationship, he's a relational God. We learned that last chapter or a couple chapters ago. But God is relational, but relationships demand trust, and God wants you to come to him in full trust in who he is, that you know who he is and that you trust him. Also, we learned that his ear is with the wronged. His ear is with the innocent people who've been wronged. He hears you when you've been wronged, when you've been broken, when something wrong has happened. God's got you. He hears you. He hears your cries. He knows and he's listening. Now, he will move in mercy, but he will always make wrong things right. His ear is with the wronged. We see that he's just. Again, that goes back to he makes wrong things right. And ultimately, we see that God is fair. He tells Cain in this passage, if you do well in your sacrifice, will your sacrifice not be accepted? Cain was jealous of Abel's sacrifice, but God said, why are you angry? Don't you know that if you just trust me, you'll be treated exactly the same way? God is fair. And while we may look at the outside circumstances and feel like there's something unfair happening, from God's perspective, he is always fair. That's part of his nature. That's part of who he is. Hope you take these 5 things, go study Genesis chapter 4, learn something, grow, seek to know more about God, dig deeper in the Word, and see you back for Genesis chapter 5. Have a good one.